Welcome to this Aztlander presentation, Teotihuacan-style censers from the Pacific coast of Guatemala, with Dorie, Reents-Budet, and Annabeth Headrick. Enjoy!
Well, all right. Thank you, Jim, and thank you everyone for spending your evening with us tonight. I'm really pleased to revisit this project that Ron and I have been working on for many years, but with the addition of Annabeth, which has truly enriched the entire process of investigating these unusual censers from the Pacific coast. Oh, come on. Here we go. So, as we all know, in Mesoamerica during the 3rd to 5th centuries, Teotihuacan moved throughout the Mesoamerican region. We know that from archaeological and especially epigraphic texts that this was mostly or partly militaristic. But along with the interaction that may have been militaristic or religious or just purely political, what it did is distributed Teotihuacan materials all over Mesoamerica, and also not only distributed materials from elsewhere to Teotihuacan, but also resident populations of foreigners at the metropolis. Now, Clara Millen was the first person to suggest that the diaspora from Teotihuacan was a Pochteca-style merchant warrior movement that really pushed the political and economic programs of Teotihuacan into other cultures of Mesoamerica. The military then, through coercion, would help the state acquire the resources that they were seeking, and also facilitated trade throughout the region via the commercial outposts that she suggests, and the archaeology also suggests that the Teotihuacanos took up residence. Now, we know also that there were varying degrees of socio-political control necessary and maintained that facilitated the flow of the commodities. But the actual nature and the degree of this control has remains still a big question. So we focus on the theater censers, the Teotihuacan-style censers, and the cylinder tripods to specifically address the nature of Teotihuacan's presence on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. Our study is primarily a formal art historical analysis of the censers as an update to the seminal investigations by Janet Berlow back in the early 1980s. If you're interested in the topic, I highly recommend you read her dissertation. I think today it still stands up as one of the finest and most useful dissertations in art history of any Mesoamerican topic. So in our study, following Janet Berlow's lead, we scrutinize the iconographic, that is the lexicon in linguistic terms, and the iconological or the grammar, or the grammatical and iconological features of the Teotihuacan censers in comparison to those of Teotihuacan. What this kind of a scrutiny of both lexicon and grammar should reveal, and does reveal, is similarities and the dissimilarities that helps us to identify both the users and the uses of these censors that really are embedded in the lexical differences and the combinations thereof within the particular parts of the censors. We also can see and track the iconographic adoption and adaptation and the innovation on the part of the makers of these censors, and probably influenced by their consumer audience. And these innovations offer us a more nuanced view, we think, of the cross-cultural contact between Teotihuacan and the people of the Pacific coast by way of conceptual continuity and disjunction, which are two key elements of art historical analysis as first described and elucidated by George Kubler and Erwin Panofsky back in the 50s and 1960s. One thing we both really want to stress is that we completely agree with Osvaldo Chinchilla that the people of the Pacific Coast in Guatemala, it was a multicultural milieu. We know from ethnohistory and from linguistic and ethnic data from colonial times and even today that there were many different immigrants and groups of people traveling along the Pacific coast and some of them taking up residence. During the Classic period, what is known linguistically or suggested is that Mihean and Socayan languages and dialects were spoken in the region. This is these discoveries made by initially written up by Catherine Josserin, Terry Kaufman, and David Mora Marin. For this reason, we eschew the use of the term Maya for describing these censers and the people on the Pacific coast. We just call them coastal peoples at this point. Now, Nick Hopkins did talk to me a while back that he believes that he has evidence for early classic populations that included Quiche and perhaps Kaqchikel or Tzutuhil also as part of the mix of the Pacific coast, but not certainly as necessarily the dominant linguistic group. So what we see in these censers, iconologically and iconographically, is they reflect this multicultural environment, and including both the Teo Nawa as well as the Mihean, Socayan, and to a very small degree, Maya as well. Now, the focus of Teotihuacan relations and residents were found in this very small subdivision in the Department of Escuintla, between the Madre Vieja River there on the left and the Achihuate River here on the right. So the archaeological evidence here that was identified by Fred Beauvais and Sonia Medrano years ago, so that they believe the archaeological evidence says that Teotihuacan operatives were resident in this area, and they were the people who introduced the state-supported ideology of sacred warfare, which is what is expressed in the theater censers. The question still remains is how deeply did these foreign Teotihuacan ideas affect the social and ideological configurations on the people of the coast, and how do we see this changing or disappearing as time went on? Now, please remember also that only one of these theater censers has been archaeologically excavated from the Pacific coast. Thus, we lack the contextual data, which gives us 95% of the social and historical information about the pieces. There's also really, since Fred Beauvais' work in this region, there have not been large archaeological excavations in the area, and specifically addressing Teotihuacan. Now, the Fundación La Ruta Maya in Guatemala City invited us to sample 33 censers and cylinder tripods from the Pacific, or supposedly from the Pacific coast. And what the work with Ron Bishop, what we were able to confirm is that all of these censers that we have sampled were made locally. There is no imports whatsoever from Teotihuacan in the ceramic repertoire that we have sampled. But what has been difficult to discern chemically is specific production locales. What you see here on the graph you see one very large group that holds the majority of our sampled censers, and then two very tiny subgroups and a couple of highly dispersed ones with very odd chemistry. So this really caused a problem when Ron and I are trying to search for inter-object relationships and places of manufacture that might tell us something about where and why and things were made. Now, we also thank very much many of our colleagues who have done archaeological excavations on the Pacific coast, who allowed us to sample pottery from their excavations. Michael Love, Barbara Arroyo, Hector Neff have been seminal in our building the compositional database so that we could compare the censers to ceramic production on the Pacific coast. But still, we have this underlying problem of this one large group and no way to statistically seriate it into any viable relational groups. And the reason is this. The Pacific coast is an area of very high rainfall and that also receives just constant influxes of volcanic ash. Thus, what we get is are clay deposits that even within 1 meter can dramatically vary in their chemical composition. So this makes it almost impossible to discern a chemical profile for ceramic production at one site. And this is the problem that we are seeing in that one big group of the censers with this one massive compositional pattern. So again, we're looking at this object-to-object similarity to hopefully discern production relationships and locales of manufacture. The goal of this would be speculations of socio-political circumstances of production and use of these highly specialized objects, and perhaps even the identity of craftspeople and patrons. However, as I said, because of the compositional nature of the clay deposits on the Pacific coast, we just had a horrible time doing so. In fact, statistically, Ron got to the point and said, okay. So when Ron Bishop just basically gave up and said there's no viable statistical way to assess relationships the way we normally do when we're using neutron activation analyses. He told me, just look to the art history and see if we can, if there's any way to start getting a sense of what might comprise a group. And these first two censers here in the green box were very obvious. You can see that very similar iconography, and if they're not the same artists, it's two artists working together, and in fact their chemistry is almost identical. They're represented over here on the left in the chart in the green box. And then there's another group here in the red box where there are similar, especially in the lexicons of these three, and they too are right in the heart of this group. The one that really threw me was the one in the purple box, because if you look at the iconography on it, there's stuff that here is not it's not at all like the others. And I expected this to be chemically different. In fact, it's right here in the center. So I started realizing that, okay, somewhat this is working. Let's look at some of these the outlying groups. And once we get into the outlying groups, we get into these notable stylistic and iconographic differences. These are notable for their atypical Teotihuacan iconography and form and specific features. And so the question here is this due to geography? In other words, production in areas far outside or away enough from this core group where Beauvais was excavating? Is this compositional drift through time? So is it a temporal issue? Is this consumer audience? Were these vessels made or these censers made for a different group of people residing somewhere else or having other production differences? And what is the meaning of this unusual icon? Well, with these icons. So I started thinking, how am I going to deal with this? Because I'm looking at this really through Maya culture eyes. Broader Mesoamerica somewhat, but I realized what was needed was to have a specialist in Teotihuacan lexicon and grammar, somebody who intimately knew how Teotihuacan artists expressed the complex ideas that made their culture work. So that's when we asked Annabeth to join the project, and I was really pleased when she agreed to join us. So, Annabeth, you want to give us a insider's view to Teotihuacan?
Crash course on what Teotihuacan is. We've been talking about it, but for those of you who haven't gotten to visit, don't die without visiting Teotihuacan because it is the place where the world was created. If you look at the Aztec stories, they talk about the sun and the moon being created there. As I tell my students, everybody thought that they were at the center of creation, but Teotihuacan was especially good at conveying that propaganda not only to their own people, but perhaps to other places in Mesoamerica. I sometimes think if we look at Teotihuacan, it's different. It's a grid-like city, whereas Maya cities often look more like an octopus with a center and everything radiates out from that. And it's massive. It's made to impress you. It's sort of like somebody who's I don't know, been living in Kansas City, no knock on Kansas City, but you go visit New York City and you think, oh, I thought I lived in a city, but no, this is what a city really is. Teotihuacan maybe had 100,000 people, more or less, living there at its height. It dates from about 100 BCE to 550 CE. And in many ways, I think it's very fair to say that it dominated the early classic period of Mesoamerica. In fact, when it collapses, you see things change all over Mesoamerica. Um, right now is a heady time dealing with issues of Teotihuacan because we've known, oh gosh, all the way back for a long time that since Proskuriakov that we knew that there were interactions with Teotihuacan and the rest of Mesoamerica, but we're finding more and more material, the things that are coming out of Tikal. And a lot of this is happening in the second half of the 4th century, although some of the earlier incursions were predating some of the things we're looking at now. All right, you can move on, Dorie.
All right. So, Annabeth brought to my attention James Langley's dissertation on censers, and he is the person who created this the basically the grammar of or a way to grammatically identify the parts of the censers. There is the massive headdress here up at the top. There are these two rectangular forms on each side that he called, whoops, sorry about that, the lateral tablets over here. Then across the bottom are usually 4 or 5 plaques that he termed the manta compound. And then the base here is it's a conical shape, and it's actually part of connected to the head, and Annabeth will talk to you about that. And then there is the working part of the censer. This is the hourglass shaped base that held the coals, and at the back of the censer there is a chimney that goes from the lid, goes up the back, and then the smoke emits out of the top. So tell us what this is, Annabeth.
Yeah. And so when you talk about the smoke that's going to be emitted from these all over Mesoamerica, the ancestors live in the cloudy, smoky world. We see it in Olmec iconography, we see it in Zapotec iconography and Maya iconography. And so when you have that smoky, cloudy world, this face that you see there is going to be residing in that ancestral realm. Especially, Carl Talbot has pointed out that this is, I've worked a lot on bundles and wrote a big article about bundles at Teotihuacan, and we can talk about the objects on the right. But if you look at this in here, he's made a good argument that this is an effigy bundle. And so when we look over at the images on the right-hand side, what we see is actually a bundle that was actually found. We have lots of accounts of bundles, and John Pohl's written a lot about the bundles for the Mixtec, and they tend to be in a fetal position. They're wrapped, they have ropes around them, and then they often will put a mask on them. The mask that you see down at the bottom in the middle of this triad group here is very typical of a Teotihuacan-style mask. Now, a lot of people didn't want to touch the masks because they were all looted. They're mostly found in museums. And there's probably a lot of fakes that are out there too, because the simple style of them makes them easy to reproduce. But people didn't want to deal with them, but they are so iconic for Teotihuacan. And it's really important to put them back into the language of what's going on at Teotihuacan. And these masks are on these bundles. And the things that are characteristic of the masks is they have an open mouth, they have eyes, often the eyes were inlaid. And so these are bundles that are able to speak and seems partially alive, but also partially where they're dead, right? They can't move, but they can speak. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. Then we have Sergio Gomez was excavating in an area we'll show you a little bit later that was just outside the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. I mean, yeah, in the Ciudadela. And he found this object, if you want to point at it, that's an effigy bundle at Teotihuacan. It's all made out of ceramic, and that little yellowish mask there is actually removable. And he's the one that argued that this was an effigy bundle. Of course, one really wonders if they put a little piece of bone or something in the middle, like a reliquary in ancient Europe, but we don't know. Patricia McEnany has some evidence that reliquaries of that sort were made by the Maya, so there's some possibility. But you can see these masks were put onto these bundles to give them that lifelike quality. And then, taking all of that, Carl went and said, oh, well, these conical shape that you have on the top of the theater censers combined with the mask, produces that mortuary bundle, but an effigy. So these are sort of the cheap versions of mortuary bundles. And then when you look at the stone masks that we have here, that's the fancy pants people. Those were the elites of Teotihuacan that had the finely crafted stone masks attached to quote unquote real mortuary bundles versus these effigy bundles that you see. All right, can go on. And I was very, very influenced by the work of Byland and Pohl in their book about 8 deer. And they talked about these bundles a lot. John Pohl wrote another smaller book they published with Vanderbilt Press about mortuary bundles. And what we see in these mortuary bundles is they do tend to sit in temples. And what you can see on the right-hand side, if you want to point at it, Dorie, is a temple. We're seeing it in profile view. This is Mixtec, so this is post-classic after Teotihuacan. But what we have is a mortuary bundle of it's an ancestral culture hero that we see in here. And we also know from Pohl and Byland's work that these bundles talked, and this was recorded very much by the Spanish and when they came into the Mixtec area, but we also can see it in the Mixtec codices. They'll have little speech scrolls and such coming out of the bundle. Huitzilopochtli was probably a mortuary bundle more than he was a deity. And if you look at images of him in the Aztec codices, he has a little speech scrolls coming out. So these were people, these bundles were things that you would consult when you were going to go to war, if you were going to get married. And I'm sure there were all kinds of little times, just like we have the Day of the Dead coming up, and people are going to be talking to their ancestors and getting advice and having them very close very soon. And that's what these bundles were like at Teotihuacan. As far as, those were the elite fancy ones, and I've suspected that those were along the Avenue of the Dead. Ergo, the article I've written on this was called The Street of the Dead. It really was, because that's an Aztec name or Nahua name for the Avenue of the Dead, but I think oral tradition kept that there really were ancestors placed along the Avenue of the Dead. But the censers we're looking at are lesser ancestors, shall we say, on the pecking order socially and culturally. And some of these, and of course, archaeology at Teotihuacan until some of the great archaeologists like Saburo Sugiyama and Linda Manzanilla wasn't so great, and things weren't always recorded. But there's some evidence that a lot of these censers are coming out of the patios in the apartment compounds. So these are household rituals, not unlike the Day of the Dead, where you do a ritual in your own house and you have a mesa in your own house and you remember your ancestors. And Dorie has on the far left, a little mini miniature temples that we find in the middle of these patios. And these are perfect places to have those household ritual spaces that you remember your ancestors on a personal level. And so you're reproducing the things that are happening in the big avenue of the dead, but in your personal home space, remembering your own ancestors. We can go on.
Yep. Yep.
That's all right.
Yep.
So what got me really interested, and Dorie's very nice about saying they invited me, but to be honest with you, I think Dorie and I had a bottle of nice something we were drinking in a hotel room during a conference, and she pulled out these images of some of the aspects. And what was really fascinating to me was I'd always been a little mystified by the parts of the censers. And here you can see some of these Teotihuacan censers and things like calling them tablets and mantas and all those names that Langley gave to them sort of exoticized these things. And it was hard to read them and understand what their iconography is. Teotihuacan art is very flat. It's almost like little cartoon characters. They tend to not have what we think of as realism very often. And so if you want to point at those, the tabletas or the on the sides, we can see some round things on them and swirly things on them, but it was actually not so easy. Now, the birds that we see on the left side, those are pretty recognizable, right? And the butterflies just down below them, we could make that iconography. And then we see that butterfly nose plaque that we'll be talking about that's on the nose of a lot of these censers in there. But the things that Dorie showed us really helped me understand the iconography. And we'll start with those mantas that you have down below that little butterfly nose plaque in the next image. So the manta, I think what Langley must have been thinking of if these were folded up pieces of cloth, which is what we use that word for, especially in the codices. But when we start looking at this, it was also helpful to have the work of people like Bill and Barbara Fash and Alex Koch-Vanine, who'd really looked at the Pyramid of the Sun and tried to understand what all this discarded sculpture at Teotihuacan was that really nobody had been looking at. And if you look at the bottom left piece, we can see some of the things that they started to identify as they argued, and I think they're absolutely right, that an earlier version of the new fire ceremony was happening at Teotihuacan. Now, the new fire ceremony is an Aztec, a post-classic event that happened every 52 years where they would put out all the fires in the empire and they would drill a brand new virgin fire. Now, how you drill a virgin fire is you take a fire drill and you put a little bit of something that's going to catch like some, I don't know, grass or something that's going to catch really well and you put a rope that's twisted around the fire drill. And you twist it in your hands really fast, and that's going to actually create friction, and it's going to create a new virgin fire where there was no fire before. If we go back to this sculpture from the Pyramid of the Sun, you can see the iconography that they showed us was there. We can see up top, that's paper. It's not a folded up piece of cloth, it's paper that's folded up to catch fire. It kind of looks like a year sign in some versions, and that's probably intentional because they was associated with creating a new calendar, a new sun, a new era. When you go below that, you see a twisted cord. That's the cord that's wrapped around the fire drill so that when you twist it in your hands, it creates that friction. And at the very top, but also especially you can see it in the bottom better, the flames. And that's the catching of fire of that. Now you go back to this so-called manta and you can see the little folded piece of paper. Up top, you can see what used to be like feathers, but now that's fire up there. And you can start to see that what we have is actually new fire symbolism, which seems to be associated also with this thing called the reptile eye that I would say that Jesper and Christoph are doing some wonderful work on what that is, and they're working on the iconography of that. So what this shows us is that when you see our fellow in the censer on the far right, he's not only got butterflies imagery on him, but he also has new fire symbolism. And this goes along with the idea that in Teotihuacan, a lot of the elites or people of high status or people that were being respected were cremated rather than being buried, prone like you think of Maya burials. And so these people are cremated in a fiery immolation and they transform into birds and butterflies. And we know this from Aztec mythology, where in the butterflies, you the Aztec tell us that through the Spaniards, but also through their own collaborators that worked with the Spaniards, that the butterflies were the souls of dead warriors. When warriors died on the battlefield or they were um, uh, killed in sacrifice afterwards, they got to turn into birds and butterflies, and they ate nectar, and it was this wonderful afterlife that was better than other people. It was frankly propaganda to get people to actually go to war and do that kind of thing for the state or the government of whatever sort it was. And so when we look at these figures, we see that their fiery immolation is part of their transformation in the afterlife into these butterflies and this idea of this special, special afterlife. And it probably also explains the bird imagery too, because they are birds and butterflies are the things that they transform into. So both the new fire beliefs and this idea of the butterfly as the souls of the dead warriors all comes from Teotihuacan before it shows up at the Aztec. And I would put the last thing, you might say, why butterflies? I know my students are always like, well, butterflies are sweet little things. What do they have to do with war? And I'm like, well, there also is some evidence that butterflies are attracted to blood. So they like sticky, sweet liquids. And so if you imagine a bunch of dead bodies laying on a field after a battle, and imagine the butterflies flitting down and dipping their little proboscis into the uh, blood of these dead warriors and flitting around, you can easily see why they might have been thought of as the souls of dead warriors rising up from the bodies and the battlefield. We can move forward. And in addition to that, we have all over Mesoamerica this idea of a covenant between the humans and the deities. In all different places in Teotihuacan, we see people sprinkling to the deities and the deities giving water and goodness back. Here you see in Zacualo, we see a bird warrior, one of these people that, is dressed as a bird, goes into war, might lose their life, but in the aftermath, they've taken someone's heart out who one suspects that even their enemy has been transformed into a bird or a butterfly. And it's that covenant that if we're going to give the blood to the earth. I've always loved John Monahan's when he captured that line ethnographically of we eat the earth and the earth eats us. You give offerings to the earth and the earth returns with agricultural fertility. And that includes rain, because Tlaloc is fundamentally an earth deity, even though we think of rain coming from the ground, from the sky, especially at Teotihuacan because they had springs. And so the water was coming from the earth and from the ground. And over on the upper right, you can see a headdress that's got human hearts probably and intestines and such like that. And it's those gifts of the most precious thing, life, in return for water and rain and agricultural fertility, and probably even the fertility of women and children as well. Do you want to add anything to that, Dorie? No, right?
No, I just except to say that there is this constant back and forth switch in Teotihuacan of showing precious liquid as either blue or red. So these are conceptually linked and really interlinked forms. And the color is when it makes reference to the blood, it's also making reference to the water.
Yeah. And if you went back one more slide,
Mm-hmm.
um, I was talking about the new fire ceremony. Another thing about these warriors is over and over again, the warriors wear a mirror on their back, which is conceptually the sun. They carry the burden of the sun on their back, things that Carl Talbot has written about. Um, and so there is solar imagery that's associated with this and the birth of a new sun that happens on that 52-year cycle. Even cremation is probably a reference to that solar rebirth, because when I was joking about the world being created at Teotihuacan, the Aztecs said that there were two deities, Nanahuatzin and Tecuztecatl, who wanted to be the sun and the moon at the beginning of time, and they created a great fire. Tecuztecatl was an elite, and he was actually ultimately too afraid, to jump into the fire. Nanahuatzin was a non-elite, and he actually ultimately jumped into the fire and became the sun. And it's through his immolation, through his cremation, in this big giant fire, that he becomes the sun. And then lame old elite Tecuztecatl jumps into the sun a little bit later and becomes the moon, which isn't quite as bright and everything. So these warriors are playing with that mythology of the sun also. And they got to travel with the sun from dawn to zenith after they finished being birds and butterflies, a little bit like riding on Apollo's chariot or something. But that we see that mythology in the Aztec too, of getting to a valiant warriors got to accompany the sun every day in a heroic way. All right, we can go to forward, Dorie.
Oh, okay.
So here you can just see all of that bird and butterfly imagery. If you want to point some of it, Dorie, I'll maybe. So here's some of those birds we were looking at before. We've got some butterflies down there. There's 4 butterflies here and 2 butterflies and 2 birds on this one there. On this other one over to the right, we can see.
Oops, sorry about that.
It's all right.
Oh, darn.
Oh no, we went all the way to the beginning. I should get a little
Just to review, I
Okay,
love
so
this
you
guy.
can see bird's eyes in the very center, and it's wearing this stylized butterfly nose plaque that Teotihuacan warriors wore in the center there. Up above, we have at the very top, we have these big round eyes, but those are antennae of butterflies that are extracted out. And then maybe moving you back down, sorry, Dorie, we have 2 birds that have these really elaborate feathered eyes and beaks sticking out at us. And this is this pleasurable afterlife that they got to go to. Maybe it's like Valhalla in the, of the Viking times, it was a better place than the average person got to go to.
And one of the features of this one that's always brought my attention is the fact that here at the top of the bird, it's wearing a headdress of the AO year sign.
Yeah, that year sign, again, referring to the sun, referring to the new fire ceremony, the immolation, all of those things that are part of this complex. And going back to when we were talking about that bundle that was found by Sergio Gomez, where that red area roughly is, just outside of the Ciudadela, is where this ceramic workshop is. Now, this is the Ciudadela, which was one of the most important parts of Teotihuacan. It has the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. There's some indication, I actually follow in both, and Saburo also, both of us think that at some point there was a ruler associated with this temple. There's a couple of different locations that could have been an ancestral burial, but they were both disturbed, and so we don't have them anymore. But you kind of wonder, like, gosh, was the king if it was a royal place at one point, was he so hard up he had to make censers? It's kind of a weird thing. But when we look at this, Saburo Sugiyama recorded a whole bunch of these censer fragments that are in that middle image. We have the molds to make the clay masks. We have molds to make the butterfly antennae and a bunch of other little motifs and such. And I'm not going to say that every single censer was this warrior imagery. There were other things being made. But we think it's a pretty high likeliness that what they were making were censers, that they were perhaps gifting out to families that had people that had been successful warriors, or maybe you should call them unsuccessful warriors that died in the process of battle. these martyrs to the state. And so they may have been making these theater censers here, gifting them out to those apartment compounds and really rewarding people for that kind of service to the state, shall we say. I often compare this, and when I'm teaching it to my students about in our country, when a soldier dies, the family is presented with a flag in an incredible ceremony of wrapping it in a very elaborate intrinsic way and with a lot of flash and theater aspects to it. And then it's presented in a precise, mechanical, but spectacular way to the family. And very often you'll find those flags displayed, say, in the family living room, in a wooden case with glass and such. I sometimes wonder if these theater censers that display the warrior imagery, especially. There's other censers at Teotihuacan, but we're talking about the ones with the butterfly imagery. If those censers were gifted from the state, just like we give those flags, and then presented and displayed in the household context. All right, Dorie, I think I'm punting to you.
Let's see, to me? Okay, all right. So now with your our much greater understanding of the forms and formats of these theater censers from Teotihuacan, now let's go to the Pacific Coast. Again, we were so grateful to the Fundación Ruta Maya to open their collections for Ron and me to sample. And just an overview of our observations, armed with an understanding now of Teotihuacan. First of all, the ones from the Pacific Coast, looking at the differences between the two, what we see is a very complex picture of use, function, and meaning on the coast. Yes, they show direct Teotihuacan contact, but the compositional data tells us they were all produced locally. In other words, what we're looking at is not just a simple takeover by Teotihuacan, and they're bringing all of their accoutrements of state ritual to the Pacific Coast. But no, there was a degree of local cooperation and accommodation that allowed the local production to be a part of this now mixed society. But at the same time, we also see myriad novel interpretations of the orthodox forms. We also see within these motifs and icons that certainly must pertain to local beliefs. And these hybrid censors imply that there were points of ideological overlap and inclusion within the two censor traditions as reflections of local ideology that allowed the Teotihuacanos to be accommodated by the coastal peoples and then pretty much through time absorbed by the local population. There are, let's see.
I can take a little.
Okay, yeah, you take these.
Earlier, I alluded, and we both alluded to the fact that there's this incredible realism when we're in this Pacific Coast area. And then when we go, back to Teotihuacan, which you see on the right, there's an abstraction to the art that is not 100%, but there's a more abstract quality. So look at the area that Dorie has put the little blue box around. If you look at the Teotihuacan, it's like a real weird little cone, and it's not as convincing of a bundle. Look at the one on the left that's made from the Pacific Coast, and it's bulgy and round, and you can see that it was wrapped in textile, maybe even textile that was feathers, right? And it's got a little disc on the front that even probably has a little hieroglyph that's naming either personally this individual or might be naming a category or a group that this individual is participating in. We kind of see both. We see elements of these things in Teotihuacan art, including the little disc on the chest there, but it's so much more rounded and soft in Teotihuacan, than the Teotihuacan art itself. So here you have these local artists that are really playing with their own style and their own interpretations. We could go forward to the next one.
Yeah, let me make a comment about that tunic. There, in classic Maya painted ceramics, in scenes of the presentation of by the war captain of prisoners or of tribute as a result of warfare, very often the elite person receiving the war captain is wearing a short cape that's tufted exactly like what you see here.
Mm-hmm.
And even in
Nice.
the painted versions, it's hard to know if it's a tufted fabric or if it's feathers or if it's fur, but it's very similar to these unusual tunics or wrappings that you see on a few of these censers from the Pacific coast.
Um, I was just looking at something on that previous one, but stay
Oh
here
yeah?
for a second.
You
Can you
want to go
point at
back?
no, point at the three mountain motif on the next one.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
see, this little three mountain motif, that's all over Teotihuacan. And in fact, it may even be almost, I want to say it's a name of Teotihuacan, but it may be something that really identifies the place of Teotihuacan. There was three major mountains at Teotihuacan that placed them and showed that they were actually in the middle of the three stones of creation. But if we go back, look at those mountains, how they're drawn. That's fairly similar to what it's like at Teotihuacan. But if you go back to this other one,
So this one?
yeah, they're weird and floppy.
Oh,
Like, see these guys up in the top
yeah.
corners? They're curlied and all. So this artist has taken that three mountain motif and kind of played with it and almost made it vegetal in that context.
Yeah.
Okay, we can go back forward.
All
Right.
right.
The other thing that's just spectacular. Again, I'm going to talk about those lateral tablets. So look at the one from Teotihuacan on the other side. They're these weird flat things, and you're like, what the heck are those? They've always kind of been problematic. These were probably originally painted. You can see traces of paint on there that would have made
Yeah.
them a little clearer,
Yeah.
but there's no indication that this guy's holding them. You have to go down to the Pacific coast and you look at the little plaques on the guy on the left, and you can see, oh, there's these wonderful little hands wrapped through these objects and holding them. These are ceremonial scepters and all kinds of different things that these people are holding. And look at the hands, they're just beautiful. Some of them have little fingernails, one's got little pointy, like
Right.
V-shaped fingernails and such. But there's this incredible realism that helps and opens your eyes to what the heck's going on at Teotihuacan, because the Teotihuacan viewer didn't need the hands. They knew that those were
Yeah.
ceremony scepters, or sometimes they're shields and dart points and such. They knew that for themselves. But the artists down in the Pacific coast made it more tangible because they were unfamiliar with this, right? And so they had to explain, no, this is something somebody holds. And so they made it more literal for the viewer on that side. You could probably go, and you can see some of that going on again. We see
Mm.
it's like the reptile eye motif, which is classic Teotihuacan and shows up in different places. And so what we have probably here is a little bit of a shield, and up above it we have the feathered end, just yeah, right there.
Okay.
Look,
Yep.
lower, lower.
Whoops, sorry.
I'm correcting her. Go a little further
Yeah,
down.
right. Yeah,
Down,
these are
down,
nice
down.
because you can actually
Yeah.
see the
But
feathers.
can you go further closer to the shield?
Oh, here?
Yeah, up above it.
Oh,
Just
this.
up above
Right.
those is we have three little dart points, which is
Yeah.
very typical of Teotihuacan, but the artist didn't really put the points on the bottom. Those are the
Yeah,
fletched or
missing.
feathered ends right there
Right.
that you
Yep.
see. Sometimes, like the one on the far right, we may be dealing with images of Teotihuacan-style temples. There's some great work by Helmke and Nielsen. They're showing that we have these named temples at Teotihuacan, and the little bird up on top may be naming this sort of owl temple or something. And then on the far left, we have a very clear example. Of course, it's a weird kind of shield because the hand goes all through it, and it looks like it has a little trace of pyrite that's or
Mhm.
mica that's degenerated in there. So it was a
Right.
more of a mirror with, again, your solar image of the mirror and the sun that these warriors were fighting for. And up above that are the fletched ends of spear points and such. And you just have this wonderful view to the realism that helps us recognize what these motifs are.
Hmm. And here the artist even included the tip of the thumb coming around
Yeah,
holding it. It's
it's
incredible.
just charming. And you see that on the other one on the far left, you can see they've totally
Yeah.
wrapped around and through this
Yep.
object.
Exactly.
Yeah. But
Okay.
you know, there's a lot of variety in this. Where you have the one on the left is actually from the Pacific coast. And what you have is if any of you guys know the Dazzler vase from Copan, there's these little floppy fabric things that Teotihuacanos seem to carry in rituals and such. And that's what that object right there is. And you can see the different colors on the textile probably. And the one next to it is actually, again, some spear points that are there and clustered together, I believe, in that context. I'm not, it's a little funky, but it's flat and it's abstracted. But this is in the Pacific coast. So we have a range of styles in the Pacific coast, which makes it fun. You can go back to the Teotihuacan one and we can see there's a little more naturalism there. Those spear points right where Dorie's pointing are a little raised and lifted. And, you know, the butterflies are kind of naturalistic in there. So you can see this wonderful hybridity of in the Pacific coast where some of it seems much more like maybe the motherland, and others is this beautiful hybrid thing. I mean, one would imagine the people coming into this area are predominantly male. These are these merchant warriors, although I think you recently had Andrew Turner speaking when he was talking about the Epiclassic to this same group. And I loved his terminology. He started calling them merchant mercenaries. And I think that may be better than merchant warriors. I think these guys were engaged in trade, but man, if they could take it for free, I think sometimes they did in that context. And they moved into these areas, but they must have married local people and adopted different traditions. And that's some of the stuff that Dorie and Ron and I've been working through.
All right. So the real point here is, and what I want to really highlight, is the amount of artistic freedom that we see in the Pacific Coast theater censers. They're mixing Central Mexican, coastal, and even neighboring Maya features that are in accordance to really the local traditions of the coast. That but some of them I really do believe, such as the Three Mountain motif. When Annabeth brought that into our conversations, I realized, of course, yeah, it's one of these idiosyncratic overlaps, so that there could be the local absorption of this foreign ideology that had points of similarity with local beliefs, but that we also see local partialities and how they're not only in how they're showing, but how they're mixing the icons with those of the Orthodox Teotihuacan narrative. So I think also some of this iconological spread or diversion that we get may be a result of the second or third generations after the first incursion of Teotihuacanos, such that the tradition had been accepted to a certain degree among the local population, and was continuing. But the further away they get from a Teotihuacan strong presence, the more we see a shift over into local ideology. And one of the things that I wanted to look at on this one was to look at these lateral tablets. These are three in the corpus that have the more abstract and the floppy end version of the lateral tablets that Annabeth is talking about. And I was wondering, okay, can we use that one feature to suggest production in one area? Or some other kind of relationship among the user of the makers and users of these vessels, where it turns out chemically they are radically different from each other. So they certainly were not made in the same workshop, and the compositional drift would suggest that there is some spatial separation between the three workshops that were making these particular censers. The one on the right is of particular interest because of the we see more on the one hand more of the local iconography, but more typical of the abstract lateral tablets of Teotihuacan, whereas you see the one here in the center, and we've got 3 burial masks up here in the headdress and this incredibly unusual butterfly, 3-dimensional butterfly. This is so unlike Teotihuacan, even though the lateral tablets maintain the traditional form of those from Teotihuacan. And let's see. Again, the mixing of the imagery, I also was looking at, all right, well, let's see if we have some similarities in composition and the butterfly nose ornaments. Well, in fact, we don't. That the amount of hybridity that we see among the makers of these censers is region-wide. So again, the question for me is this a temporal issue, or is this just simply an inherent nature of the milieu of the mixture and the accommodation of foreign and local populations? We definitely see, especially in the butterfly nose plaques, a huge amount of experimentation of naturalism that we don't see at Teotihuacan. Yeah, there are still some that retain the more geometric version. But again, there's no similarity in production, and this is something that is region-wide, and there's really no correlation that we can find between having a more geometric nose plaque and the other surrounding iconography in terms of the degree of Teotihuacan-like or more local iconography.
Can you
So
go back
this
to
is,
that one real quick, Dorie?
yep.
You know, when I was looking at this one and the one in the upper right, what's really
Hmm.
fascinating about that one is here this is in the Pacific Coast, but it shows an intrinsic knowledge of Teotihuacan iconography. I've written an article where I talked about the butterfly nose pack actually representing Tulud Tablero. This artist knows that the butterfly nose plaque represents Tulud Tablero, that the Teotihuacan form of architecture really is a butterfly because the framing of it with those red frames is exactly how Teotihuacan architecture is done. So there's an incredible knowledge of what's going on, hundreds of miles away.
Right. And I think that holds true also for this one because in places like Cholula, when tablero that are underneath the current, the outer shell of the main pyramid, there are remains of the painted panels, and there are these big circles on them, just as we see here. So going back to the censer, the coastal censer with the abstract lateral tablets, the Teotihuacan-like ones, a major notable feature is the fact that in the headdress, no longer do we have the butterfly. We should see the butterfly or the birds, but that icon has been completely removed. Instead, what we see is this face with, this is what Nick Helmuth was first to talk about this and named him Curly Face. Um, and the standing interpretation is that this is life breath, as we see elsewhere in Mesoamerica, issuing from the nose of this supernatural entity, whatever he is. Here on the right is a vessel. This one is from the coast, but we also find these at Kaminalhuyu, again, of this sort of curly face individual. This is an icon associated specifically with the coast, the Piedmont area, and then immediately adjacent regions from Amatitlan up to Guatemala, to the Valley of Guatemala. So here we have on the censer very standard Teotihuacan iconography, and then a primary ideological entity of some type sitting on the top of the censer. Now, in this case, the curly face person, deity, does have the butterfly eyebrows. There is the mirror and there is the fire erupting from the top. However, this is a purely coastal icon, and this is Teotihuacan. So a very
Although
interesting mixture. Yeah,
he does have the butterfly antennae, so they've just stuck that on little curly face,
yeah. Yep, exactly. But the fact that the censer can accommodate a deity, an entity, a spiritual entity specific to the coastal region, along with this Orthodox Teotihuacan imagery, shows this accommodation of the two traditions.
Absolutely.
So, um, once we start getting a little bit out of that central group of basically the massive group of somewhat chemically similar vessels, we start finding other censers that reflect more of local traditions than they do of Teotihuacan. In particular, one is this elderly male figure. In this case, it's very clear that he is a sacrificer. And if you remove this little trapezoidal door, there is a Teotihuacan warrior inside this elderly figure. So this imagery is consistent within the censors of the Pacific Coast, and we believe that this theme is very much related to the old man, the mom related, the mountain thunder rain deity that Lucia Henderson has spoken about or written about, and with her work at Lake Atitlan. And so thinking about Lucia's work and the importance of the three mountains as creating a spiritual place of origin at Atitlan. Um, Very likely there is a connection, an ideological connection between the three mountains that identify Teotihuacan as a place of origin, and similarly at Atitlan. And this old man imagery is connected to that broader ideology specific to the coastal region. We also find a number of seated females censors. And they range from a female associated with cacao, the one on the left here holding a cacao pod and cacao flowers in her head wrap. Another of a seated female holding this crested bird. She sometimes has wings herself and often a large bird headdress. And a third type is a seated female holding an owl. Um, and the butterfly here, so this is, there is some retention of Teotihuacan iconography here, but at the same time, there are other features of this figure that presage the late classic tiki sateware figurines. So this one on the right in particular may be one associated with a temporal shift away from the initial decades of the Teotihuacan presence. We also see a similar amount of variation in the imagery and the artistry of the cylinder tripods, the Teotihuacan-style cylinder tripods from the Pacific Coast. Um, there are a number of features that are distinctive about these in comparison to the censers, in that the artistic quality and their style and their chemistry are much more diverse than what we are seeing in the censers. These three features suggest a much broader geographic distribution and possibly a broader consumer audience outside of the ruling elite of the coast, and perhaps also a longer time period of use of production and use of these tripods as compared to the censers. So, in summary, what we are thinking these days is that these hybrid censors and the tripod vessels from the Pacific Coast illuminate Teotihuacan's expansionistic efforts along the coastal zone, and also its role as a source of both religious and political symbols as well as practice. But yet we're absolutely adamant that these were grafted onto indigenous civil social politics that resulted from Teotihuacan's really transformative presence in this region and throughout the early classic Mesoamerican territories. And the hybrid censors intimate that really, like most invaders, Teotihuacan persons were certainly resident on the Pacific coast, especially in the heart of the region here in the Balberta and La Montana area where Beauvais and Medrano were excavating. But yet, as Annabeth mentioned also, certainly some of these foreigners married local women and produced admixed families that were easier to accommodate newcomers' tenets alongside both the established practices and religious beliefs. The varied paste compositions that we see in the censers and the tripod vessels also incorporate or reflect this incorporative process. The tripods especially, we think, illuminate the greater temporal and broader geographic distribution and range of the consumer audience, given that especially that their diverse chemistry, their very hybrid iconography, and the, let's say, variable technical skills and aesthetic aptitudes are much greater than what we see in the censers. So, in conclusion here, Teotihuacan's presence in southeastern Mesoamerica generated a very complex pattern of geography, economics, sociopolitics, and ideology that fluctuated over time as Teotihuacan's influence reached its apogee and soon thereafter disintegrated. Similar to what Claudia de Laurier's conclusions from her excavations at Los Horcones, located just up the coast here, across the border into Chiapas. She states that her analysis is that local leaders continued to utilize the foreign symbols of Teotihuacan as socio-political currency to augment their local prestige and to demonstrate membership in larger regional economic and ideological systems within the broader southern Mesoamerican region. So what is now needed is an archaeological focus on the core area of production to refine the current broad brush interpretation of the Teotihuacan incursion. And this summer, when Annabeth and I were in Guatemala City, we were very pleased to spend a wonderful afternoon with Tomas Barrientos and Mariana Sanchez, who are in the initial stages of a new Pacific Coast archaeological project focusing on the Teotihuacan censers and these questions of the Teotihuacan incursion in along the Pacific coast. And Ron and I particularly want to remind everyone how grateful we are to myriad of colleagues and institutions who have opened their collections to us for sampling. Without their open cooperation, we never would have been able to build this massive database of neutron activation data, which will carry on in the hands of Wes Stoner, director of the Nuclear Research Reactor at University of Missouri. And also, I would like to personally thank Jim for acquiescing and in his publication, allowing us to list many of our resources. There are references cited in our paper. Again, Annabeth and I are standing on the backs of many, many wonderful colleagues who have started building a solid base upon which we can then move forward and hopefully in a better understanding of the nature of Teotihuacan's presence along the Pacific coast. Annabeth, you have last words?
No, I ditto to all the thanks to everyone. It's always a team effort. Mesoamerican archaeology is never by yourself.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful, ladies. That was an excellent, excellent presentation. We do have a lot of questions in the chat. And you just mentioned Tomas Barrientos, and I've been chatting with him, and he gave me his email address so he can do his own program next year for us. And maybe he'll chime in on this Q&A. Thank you. And Sofia Paredes Mari is, let's see, an hour and 15 minutes late, but she just joined us. So hopefully she'll jump in on the Q&A also. So some of the questions, is there any archaeological proof of elites being cremated at Teotihuacan? I mean, real solid proof.
So some of that you can, I think I put in the chat, Erica, you can look at Simpowski and Spence's work and evaluate for yourself whether it's proof or not. Data in Teotihuacan archaeology until the recent folks is always problematic. It's just maddening, a lot of throwing of things away. But that would be your best source if you want to look at what data there is, and then of course look at Linda Manzanilla's and David Carballo's work in the apartment compounds. But some of those apartment compounds are not elite compounds, so it doesn't always give us as much information when it's the lesser elites.
But since they haven't, that I'm aware of, discovered any royal burials or bone houses, and the same thing is going on at El Mirador, where Richard Hansen, I've asked him about bone houses. He says, no, I don't think so. No royal burials so far. Wouldn't you think maybe that they were being cremated?
It's problematic, and I know it's speculative, but when we look at those masks from Teotihuacan, they were probably very easily acquired. Those things were picked up by the Aztec in the post-classic time. They were grabbed up in the pre-1900 and got moved into collections. And one wonders if when they burned along the Avenue of the Dead and attacked the elite spaces at the collapse of Teotihuacan, if those mortuary bundles were there, they were A, perhaps already cremated remains, and B, all you'd get left are these masks that were laying there of these destroyed mortuary bundles. And you can look at the Mixtec codices where you see the attacking of mortuary bundles and the burning of bundles was to get rid of people's ancestors and their power base. Also, we see similar behaviors, I think, if you look at Patricia McEnany's work for the Maya, about ancestral power. You needed the ancestors and destroying them. But I would love for a royal burial to be found at Teotihuacan. That would be awesome. It's possible they weren't because they were bundled burials and we're not going to find them.
Oh. Alan Christensen wondering about the butterflies. Could the curled motifs be provises instead of antenna at the top of the censers? Butterfly antenna are mostly straight with knobs. I was a etymology major back in undergrad, so therefore annoying. Also, aren't those quetzals, owls, or some other birds with short beaks? You'd think they'd prefer hummingbirds, as like butterflies, they sip nectar. Quetzals don't.
Okay, so if you look at the long version of that, in my article about the butterflies is in that older book about ancient Mesoamerican warfare, and I talk about all the different parts. And yes, the curled part in the middle is a proboscis, and the antennae are the floppy things on the other side. And they do show those over and over again. I just didn't point them out, Alan, but they're there. But if you want to look at it in the article version, it is there. As for those birds, oh God, I don't know. People called them owls, then they called them quetzals, and then I squishy. Yeah. If they are quetzals, I don't have a problem with that at all. I don't know what your thoughts are, Dorie.
To me, they consistently look more like owls than anything else. Um, if you look at the range of variation of in Aztec, for example, of eagles and owls, the one main identifying figure or part of those two birds is the big round eye surrounded by the feathers. And so taking that back to Teotihuacan, so many of those look to me to be owls of the birds.
Yeah. It's sort of like the formative period stuff. I think Taubes started arguing that some of those that we called harpy eagles were quetzals, but then the beaks are often wrong, right?
Right.
Because they're more the quetzal beak,
Mhm.
or they're a hooked beak that's a raptor, and that can't be a quetzal. And it's a perfectly wonderful question to ask, Alan, and those birds are problematic.
I always thought of them as owls, and that's what shows up in the, oh, what do you call it? The war
Yeah,
banner.
I mean, we always called it the owl and the owl and I'm sorry, I'm going between Spanish and English in my mind. The oddle owl, yeah, was always called owl, but there are indeed people that wonder if those are quetzales.
Oh, can the accommodation to Teotihuacan also be termed as submission?
You want to go first, Dorie? I
Well,
don't
you
see
mean,
evidence of conquest necessarily, so.
right. See, that's our point, that just looking at these censers, which are the quintessential statement of the Teotihuacan state ideology, when they get transferred to the Pacific coast, immediately you start seeing hybridization of the iconography. The artists are taking liberties. They're adding other icons that very likely are local. And so we surmise then if Teotihuacanos had actually totally taken over control of the Pacific coast, certainly they would have wanted to control the production of artifacts that are a direct reflection of the state or the state ideology. And we don't see that. We see this hybridization. That's why we're seeing more of an accommodation than outright total political and social takeover.
And I would add to that also clinging to ideas of your past over generations, perhaps, of this form of ancestral worship and military service that's uniquely from somewhere else, even though you haven't lived there for quite some time, and hanging on to those old traditions. But I think we see that in our own place, people that still have German festivals that have never been to Germany, right? But their ancestor came over from there.
And then we had a question. First, David has an answer, but the question from Sulijin was, please explain the term theater censor. Then David says that term comes from the framing of the center looking like a stage of a theater, but that's not the intent. Another term is composite censor, which is not that better, but emphasizes their different mold-made parts.
I'll accept all of that. Yes. I mean, we
Sure,
get
why
these
not?
names like, Manta, and it's not a Manta. And we hang on to old names because if I say those words, another Mesoamericanist or a person that's interested in Mesoamerica knows what it is, but they really are inaccurate.
And then when you mentioned you only found one in an architectural context, which would have been reconstructed, but the ones that you have, like at the Fundación Maya, were they, I mean, glued back together? I mean, how long do you think they had been in their presentation form that you see them today?
What we know archaeologically, and Tomas and Mariana are finding this as well, is that these probably were intentionally broken and buried. And I first started seeing these censers at the Fundación back, 2008 when they were first donated, and they came in fragments in boxes. And the Fundación pieces have been very carefully reconstructed and documented. And Sophia was very careful working with the conservator to make sure that what got reconstructed was what they actually could reconstruct from the fragments that they were given. So unlike many censers that you see in private collections and in museums that have suffered over restoration, the ones at the Fundación are believable, and there is total documentation of the reconstruction, but these are found smashed.
Oh,
And the same as at Teotihuacan, like Linda Manzanilla, the one she found was taken apart and put into a cremated area. burned area.
So I see some comments from Sophia. She was had the time wrong in her phone. She thought she was going to be early. But Sophia, please unmute. I've asked you to unmute and chime in here with us.
Gracias. Hello. I am really sorry. I'm 2 hours of difference, and I didn't notice that. Just to comment on Dorie's information. Yes, La Ruta Maya has several incensarios in the collection. Most of them came already registered to the collection, and most of them came glued together by from the original collections. It is important to mention that some of the incensarios came fragmented in boxes, but they are very, very few. Most of them came badly glued together. And we did some consolidation with, of course, the authorization of the Cultural Property Register, that is el Registro de Bienes Culturales of IDAE. But most of them, when they come in with us, come complete, even if they are completely fractured. So it's necessary to consolidate them in order to make them, they don't have the danger of collapsing or fragmenting more. What La Ruta Maya does is that any consolidation we have done, we do not add any additional ornament or adorno in order to keep as original as possible the integrity of the incensario. Unless they are in danger of instability, there something can be added to the base of the structure of the lid, but usually not. So what Dorie says about being completely fragmented is true, but they come glued together, and we still have to request permits again in order to consolidate many of them, because we don't like them to be so fragile.
So
Did you hear? Sí.
yeah, as Tomas mentioned, the Los Chatos censer is the only one that has been archaeologically excavated, and Los Chatos is a suburb of Montana, a very large archaeological site in the study area, and it is on display in the National Museum. But that's the only one that's been archaeologically excavated, and it too was reconstructed. It was broken.
Let's see, Joey has a question, and again, David has responded, and I just emailed David and asked him, like, who are you? Should you be doing your own Aztlander program, and give me your email address? But Joey asks, do you have any thoughts as to why the Teotihuacan censers seem more fragile, with a lot more open space as compared to the Pacific Coast examples, which have less open space and are more substantial? And then David says, no, not really, but we have examples of formative cremations that seem higher status, like Laguna, and know that was a practice in Aztec times, so we would imagine it happened in Teo times. But in over 25 years of excavating there, oh, David's at the excavating at Teo. There I've only encountered one burial that could be partially cremated. David, give me your email address. So do you have any comments of why the Teo were different from the Pacific?
I thought that was a fascinating insight, and I never really caught it. We're just kind of, we're still finding things on these and figuring it out. And I think it's fascinating. It's a stylistic difference, and it's an interesting one. It's an important one. I'm glad you pointed out.
Yeah, that's the first thing that really struck me is how much more open are the Teotihuacan censers, and they don't have the backdrop, the back proscenium of the theater that you find consistently on the ones from the Pacific Coast. That is, I would say, the primary stylistic difference between the two censer traditions.
Do you think that's David Carrasco?
I think you're talking to David Carballo, aren't we, David?
Carballo.
Identify yourself, man. But yeah, and when you're talking about household archaeology and stuff, he's your guy. He and Linda Manzanilla, they're amazing.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
among other things, David does all kinds of stuff at Teotihuacan, so it's not just that.
well, we'd love to have you next year, David. Keep in touch with me. Mananetta says, yes, owl imagery, owl eye imagery, also owl beaks are small triangle shapes. Tomas says, excellent talk for a very complex issue. We're getting some people leaving, so they're saying terrific program, great lecture. Nose plaque talud tablero is a butterfly. Interesting. Thanks for this interesting lecture. I would to ask if you or your colleagues have studied or identified the pigments.
There are people working on pigments at Teotihuacan, and that is not an area that I work in, and I defer to their excellent, excellent work.
All right. Erica's asking Sophia if she's learning Dutch, and Sophia says, Hola, I don't understand. Tomas says the exception seems to be the Los Chatos censer, the only one found in context. It was buried inside the floor of a residential structure. And Leonard has a question I've always had about the censers is about the circles above the heads and eyes. How much variation is there in the amount? So far, I've seen mostly 5 or 4 in your presentation. If I recall correctly, I also saw one with 3. Are there other numbers?
I don't know if numbers, I haven't seen a pattern in numbers, and I don't think there's going to be, but if there is, fine, but I don't think there is. There's kind of 2 big categories of those round things. A lot of them have mica at the center or pyrite, and they're shiny. I always get those 2 mixed up, and I apologize, and David's probably laughing at me. So when we look at those, there's some that have a 4-petaled flower, and probably goes along with that idea of being in the flowery world with the butterflies and the birds and this beautiful paradisiacal kind of place. And others seem to be feathered mirrors or feathered shields that, are much more along with like what Carl Tabo's written about with mirrors and feathers and such like that in his wonderful seminal article on that.
Alrighty. Mark Brenner says he and Susan Milbreth are both here, and it's great to be here. Let me get back to questions. Sophia says La Ruta Maya does not reconstruct, only consolidate what is already glued and fragile. Antonio says, thank you for the presentation regarding the color scheme of the Pacific Coast centers. Have you seen cyan, light blue used aside from the predominant reds, yellows, and greens? There's a museum in Antigua, Guatemala with several examples from a private collection, yet only one had cyan light blue on it. My friend suggested it may have been the result of an illicit restoration done improperly, as all the colors in the piece seem to be so well preserved.
I think the blue is extremely rare. I'm trying to think of an example that I can be sure is ancient, and I really can't. So that I would concur with his observation that the one that he saw in a private collection may be an over-restoration.
Alrighty. And Susan Berth says, thank you to both of you for this engaging presentation. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If there's anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question in person, please do so very quickly. Let me see if there's any raised hands. Elaine, Sheila, you have no questions? My gosh. And there's no glyphage on this, so Barb hasn't chimed in. Nothing to do about caves, except the theater stage looks like a cave. All right. Well, ladies, this has been excellent. I hope that with the recording, I can piece together what's hopefully going to drop on my computer. I've been having problems lately with, I've learned to close Photoshop, close InDesign, close all these other programs. I only have the email, Word, and Acrobat open, but yet it's still giving me memory problems. One comment here. Thank you, Dorie and Annabeth. Terrific talk.
David, you look like you're dying to say something.
No, I really appreciated this talk. It was wonderful. Yeah.
Dave, would you like to do your own talk next year?
He's amazing. You should have him. His work is, it's incredible.
Huh.
Well, likewise. I feel that about the both of you. Yeah. And it was so great to hear about all this stuff that you've been doing.
Okay, you have to come to my talk at the SAAs because I'm going to show you some mortuary bundles, David.
Okay.
It's kind of weird. I'm starting to pick up, and Dorie knows this, that there's things that don't seem, although I need more access to the Teotihuacan censers to confirm some of the stuff I need to look at, but there's things that seem to be Teotihuacan, but don't show up at Teotihuacan, but show up down there.
Yeah, they make it clearer.
Yeah, you know, and there's these like bundle images, and I don't think I've seen them in Teotihuacan censers, but they're showing them there. It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, it's this nostalgia almost, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it seems fascinating. Like, just it's much more naturalistic what they have there.
Yeah.
I'm so.
Oh, I still remember when the Dazzler vase came out. I'm like, oh, you know, I just couldn't understand that iconography. I'll totally admit.
I must admit that when I first was at Copan and first saw the vase and I guess it was Bob asked me, so is this Maya? And he goes, it's Teotihuacan, right? And I started looking at it, and at the time I had started working on this Pacific Coast Censers, and I looked at it and looked at it and looked at it and realized, no, this is Teotihuacan iconography, ideology being expressed, but this is a Maya artist because of the way that the bundle was shown, exactly, the hands, the shields. This is pure, you know, southern Mesoamerica. It is not at all Teotihuacan. So that was the first inkling that I got that I'd really better pay a lot better attention to Teotihuacan iconography. I'm going to start working on this material because it's just I think we are programmed to see iconography, to see the words, and not really to see the iconology, the overall grammar. And so we get enamored, we get brought in by the iconography, trying to identify all the little parts and forget to look at how is it all put together and presented. because it's that part, the iconology, as Panofsky wrote about beautifully, that is what's going to tell you something about the person and who made the piece and the audience for which it was made.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's an entirely new culture. They're not Teotihuacanos per se, you know. It's as Dorie was really imprinting, is that it's a hybrid area, and it's just really wonderful to see that cultural exchange.
Yeah. They're such beautiful pieces. Yeah.
Find any of the Teo influence? I mean, Escuintla, I'm very familiar with. When I lived in Guatemala for 7 years, I would go through the middle of Escuintla to get to the beaches. Great surfing along the Escuintla coast. But I mean, obviously, it's the Teotihuacans were coming along that trade route all the way down to what, Costa Rica or something. But is there any evidence up into like Kaminahuyu of this Teo influence?
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
you
Maybe
should
you
talk
can
to
talk about
Barbara
this.
Arroyo. She's the one.
What? Arroyo.
Barbara Arroyo. Yeah, she's wonderful. She's the one to speak about that connection. Yeah.
She chimed in last week at Clemency Coggins' presentation. Yeah, I'll try to get in touch with Barbara. It's been overdue already. Well,
Well,
question.
and then I think I would just, when you talk about all that movement, I mean, Teotihuacan didn't invent this, right? You know, people are now looking at the formative period and seeing all of that material that's coming down from the Gulf Coast into El Salvador and such. You know, this was always a corridor that people were moving through to get really wonderful goodies.
All right. Syncretism seems to apply like how Maya book took in Catholicism. Must have been something somebody said that tipped that off. And yeah, let me see one last comment here in the personal chat. Oh, Thomas has raised his hand. Thomas, go ahead.
Hi, Tomas.
Hola.
Yes,
Congratulations. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Just to give a comment that now we know that Escuintla was not the only region where the censors show this hybrid. I mean, your argument of Teotihuacan being interpreted by more local cultural patterns, and just to mention that now we know that there are theater style censors in Tikal. I mean, not as complex as the ones in Escuintla, but now we know that they were also producing censors in Tikal. And just to add something about the last question, the censors in Amatitlan Lake, which is like halfway between Escuintla and Caminalcuyú, and there you see Teotihuacan iconography, but in a very, very local style. So we see all these degrees of Teotihuacan influence, if you want to see that. Of course, we don't see censors at Caminalcuyú, but the ones in Lake Amatitlan really show how. I mean, I think it's wonderful to have that comparison, because it shows that the Escuintla ones were the ones that were more close to the canonic iconography, and that's why I mean they are more interesting. But we see all these local interpretations of Teotihuacan iconography, at least in Amatitlan and now in Tikal. So I mean, we have a lot to study.
Right. And we shouldn't be surprised that that's happening at Tikal, right? I mean, we've had the problematic vase forever, and we know that they were coming in and bringing these ideas. And it's interesting that the censer seems to be one of these things that was just you couldn't part with even if you left home. You know, that ritual was critical, and that's something I'm interested in exploring.
It would be very interesting once the censers get completely excavated and maybe some of them reconstructed, is to compare the Teotihuacan ones to Tikal, to the coastal pieces. And as Tomas says, the Amatitlan ones are amazingly different. And I don't know, Tomas, is that temporal, do you think? Are those later, slightly later than the ones from the Montana, Los Chatos area?
I think they're more or less the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
What I can say about what I've seen from the Tikal ones is that the iconographic repertoire is very, very limited. I mean, they have the three mountain
Really?
symbols. They have more Tlaloc images, but it's a very limited variation in their adornments. You know,
Interesting.
it seems that it was more centralized probably, and it's not as the variation. I mean, you presented from a squintlet. But the Amatitlan ones, I think they date more or less at the same time. Given the investigations in the sites of Mexicanos, I mean, it's pure Esperanza phase, you know.
the ones at Lake Amatitlan, wasn't that more like offerings that were thrown into the lake?
Yes, yes,
Yes.
exactly, yeah. But some of them were, I mean, some of them even have talud tablero bases. I mean, they have very straight Teotihuacan related imagery, but they're more local than any other that I can think of.
It was obviously a style that was cherished by the local people that were creating them, and they would see that as a as a great offering to offer the gods, especially with Lake Amatitlan being so close to the volcanoes. Uh, I can see how that would be a great offering.
And the other thing is, Michael Love brought to my attention the long history of figural censers on the Pacific coast, because there are censers found that are middle preclassic that have human figures sculpted on the outside of them. So this is a long-standing local tradition. It's just that what we see is as different groups come in contact with each other, that there is change in the format and the iconography of these censers. It's not as if Teotihuacan brought the whole idea of a celebratory censer to the Pacific coast, but it was grafted onto an already 800-year-old tradition.
And then my friends in Puerto San Jose, they had some land when they had some coffee somewhere, and just planting coffee plants, they found a beautiful molded head that they gave me. But what was distinctive was that the eyeballs were actually round clay embedded in the rest of the face. And Tomas, do you find other things? Oh, he's off again. I was wondering if that's a style that's from the Pacific coast where eyeballs were actually round eyeballs. But he's backed away from the presentation again. Alrighty, ladies, this has been great. Thank you much for doing this, and thank you for the beautiful article in the Aztlander. And thank you folks that have stuck it out this late. And although 2 hours isn't bad, I mean, Barbara McLeod's first presentation for me was 3 hours and 20 minutes. And I do have, for those of you asking about a recording, Sophia, I've got to investigate it. And hopefully when I end this, part of it will download on my computer and then part of it in the cloud. I've never trusted the cloud, so I don't know if I even have a password to the cloud, but I'll hopefully I'll get a notice and a link.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate everyone being here.
Thank you, Dorie. Thank you, Annabeth. And with that, I'll end it for all. Thanks for showing up.
Good night, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.